small child?
Well, my father was like an obsessive classical music fan. So he was a kind of... He wasn't just a fan, he was a sort of a bit of a nut. He was obsessed with Franz Liszt. And he used to go to Franz Liszt's birthplace in Hungary or Austria every year, drive there in his Morris Traveller, and bring back a little sort of phial of soil from Liszt's birthplace and kind of wear it around his neck for the rest of the year. He was this kind of...
That's obsessive.
Yeah, he was a bit obsessive, yeah. I'm sure he would have been a Liszt groupie if Liszt hadn't have died 200 years before he was born. But so I was kind of brought up with kind of classical music blaring throughout the house. It was kind of quite a strange upbringing. Grew up in a tiny little council house down near Brighton. But there was quite a lot of kind of culture, you know, and one of the strongest elements of culture I was exposed to was classical music. And so automatically, you know, like you do when you're a sort of 11, 12, 13-year-old kid, you completely reject the values that your parents impose on you. And the first ever band that I was into was a band called Crass, which were a kind of like a bizarre sort of like political kind of like post-punk band, and as far away from Franz Liszt as you could possibly get. So,
what was your first brush with Crass then?
My first brush with Crass was buying a record at Hayward Heath Market called The Feed and the 5000, and not realising that it was supposed to be played at 45 RPM and playing it at 33 RPM, and this kind of like hearing this really slow down voice, you know, this kind of like almost like this kind of like satanical voice, and being fascinated to the point of being shocked at how kind of amazing it sounded. And then when someone told me at school it was actually supposed to be played at 45 RPM, it sort of lost some of the magic.
Was that the first record that you bought?
It wasn't. No, the first record I bought was the Sex Pistols, Never Mind the Bollocks, which was, yeah, I mean, it's still one of the greatest records ever made for me in my book. It's kind of an amazing piece of music and art, or whatever you want to call it, yeah. But that was the first.
What led you to that album? Because that's, you know, was it the kind of image of the band? Was it just hearing things on the radio? Did you see them on TV? How did that relationship start?
I was too sort of young to really be to be aware of the whole thing while it was happening with punk. You know, I was born in '67, so when punk was really happening, I was only 10. So it wasn't until a couple of years later that you start developing kind of like cultural consciousness, for want of a better phrase. And it kind of filtered through to me, and because I didn't live in Soho, you know, I lived in the suburbs, it kind of like, it took a couple of years to sort of filter down to us. I don't know, I suppose there was something very exciting about the whole punk thing. You know, it was kind of like really inverting traditional musical principles, sort of turning stuff on its head. And that probably appealed to me as a kind of like a snotty young teenager, yeah. I think it appealed to lots of people.
What was the first concert that you went to? Can you remember going to your first gig?
God, I think it was probably... The first gig I went to was quite... I didn't go to gigs for a while. I think the first gig I went to was New Order, actually, down in Brighton.
Good first gig.
Yeah. It was... God, when was it? It was sometime in the 80s. Must have been around the time of sort of Blue Monday, maybe slightly after that, yeah.
Did it make a big impression on you?
It did, yeah. I think not as big an impression as seeing the Cult, actually. The Cult were one of the greatest live bands I'd ever seen, and that remains true to this day. I thought Ian Astbury had an amazing presence live, and they seemed to take the kind of like the whole sort of performance thing to a new level. So seeing the Cult in about 1984 was pretty special.
What's the Cult song that does it for you?
Well,
because I wouldn't immediately take you looking at your musical heritage.
No, it's a strange little anomaly, the Cult. But I was actually a member of the Cult fan club as well. I used to get a Cult newsletter. It's a funny one, isn't it?
And your Cult fan club name will be Firewalker.
I mean, She Sells Sanctuary is, you know, one of the greatest rock records ever made. It's an astoundingly brilliant record, and it's still amazing today. I went to see it at the Albert Hall a couple of months ago, and it was just like, they played Love, the album that's from, which is a fine album, but the mood was great and everyone was enjoying it. And then they suddenly played that song, and just the whole place erupted, because it is an amazing song, and it's one of the greatest riffs.
At what point did loving this music and getting enthusiastic about this music start to kind of sink in with, well, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. Was there a moment when you realised that you wanted to be the person rather than watching the singer, being the singer?
Yeah, I think there was. I mean, it was quite a strange time in the 80s, because there was a lot of great music being made, but it was all kind of in the underground. I think there wasn't, mainstream music was pretty horrible. There was about 2 acts, looking back at the 80s, Prince and the Pet Shop Boys, who were in the mainstream, that I actually liked, and everything else was things like the Smiths and the Fall and New Order and stuff like that, which were fantastic. But when you used to watch Top of the Pops in those days, it was kind of like those are sort of weird bands with lots of hair. And I did remember watching Top of the Pops one day and just thinking, God, I can do better than this. This is just so boring and bad, and it's time to sort of have a go myself, So finally got, sick of being frustrated, and started some bands together. Met Matt Osman at college, the bass player in Suede, and he had a goth band called Paint It Black, which I joined.
Black.
Yeah, I know.
That's a good name for a goth band.
It's a very good name for a goth. But Matt used to be a goth. That's what Suede fans don't realise about him. He's eternally embarrassed about it. But I've got pictures of him with backcombed hair and a paisley shirt.
Nice.
Yeah.
What was the first band called?
The first band that we were in was called Paint It Black.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
So you were part of that.
Yeah, but
band.
it was sort of, all these bands are just sort of, they're all kind of, it's all just sort of learning your craft, really. There's nothing to be taken seriously from them. We were also in another band called Jeff, which was almost like a House Martins-inspired band, So like anyone of that age, you're kind of just, you're just sort of sucking in all the influences in a very crass way, and kind of, reflecting them in a very obvious way, and it's all just sort of part of the whole learning process. And I think you need to have that kind of like that process in order to learn how not to do it, almost, I think, and it's not until years and years later that you get proficient enough and confident enough to actually do it yourself in a kind of with any elegance.
And in a way that's yours, rather than just aping someone else's style.
Exactly, yeah. Or to take influences and to sort of twist them and use them in your own voice. In
terms of influences, the Smiths is a name that always comes up when people talk about Suede. When did you first hear the Smiths?
First heard the Smiths. I mean, I'd heard the Smiths, but the first time it really, really got through to me, I think I was listening to John Peel, like most kind of kids did, who had any sort of taste in 1983, and I heard What Difference Does It Make? And there's a line in What Difference Does It Make, which is, but still I'd leap in front of a flying bullet for you, and it just really struck me as really powerful and beautiful. And from then on, I did really love the Smiths, and they were a very kind of important band for me growing up. I was sort of like going through adolescence at a time when they were at their peak, and lots of their material was about the confusion of adolescence, so it kind of resonated doubly with me, at the time.
When did you first meet Bernard Butler? One of the most important meetings.
Me, Justine, and Matt had started a band. We weren't called Suede yet. We were called, oh God, something like The Perfect or something awful like that. And we were kind of like, writing these sort of dippy little kind of hippie songs inspired by Joni Mitchell and stuff. It's all very acoustic and sort of like nicey. And we kind of got sick of, not really doing anything and getting nowhere. And we decided to put an advert in the NME, and I put an advert in the NME saying, listing a few influences, and I just, one of the things I said was, no musos but no beginners. We wanted someone that was, that's the thing, if you put adverts in the music press, you'll just end up with sort of like people that are into heavy metal bands and can do all of this sort of shredding and, this technical nonsense that no one really cares about except people that, read Kerrang. So we wanted someone, like Bernard, to answer the advert, and Bernard answered it, so that was nice. And then we met him, and I remember we had a little rehearsal in my flat at the time. There's a place called Highlever Road, just by Ladbroke Grove, and he came along, and you know, obviously he was an absolutely amazing guitar player, and he was very young and very intense and very shrewd, and there was no doubt in my mind that we could do something pretty special together. Yeah.
The first Suede gig that had the lineup that went on to start recording professionally. What was that first concert like? Do you remember?
I can't remember the exact first gig, but the first gig that anyone ever half paid attention was a thing called On for 92, which is part of the NME sort of end of year celebrations in 1991 at the venue, and we played with a couple of other bands, a band called Fabulous and a band called Adorable, and it was the first time anyone had ever sort of noticed us or written about us or anything like that. I think the NME wrote a little piece about it.
When did you start to feel that there was something happening? I mean, even before The Drowners, which was the first single, there seemed to be a certain amount of kerfuffle.
Yeah, I think we first really noticed things happening where I think our first ever kind of proper review was we played the Falcon in Camden Town, and Morrissey turned up, and Suggs turned up, and Kirsty MacColl, and it's like, what are they doing here? How weird. Because we didn't, you didn't really know, but obviously there was a bit of a word of mouth sort of thing, and then there was a review in the NME, and it sort of, we were very proud of it, it's just this little review, but it sort of seemed to really get us. And
what did it say?
It's just the reference points, some of the sort of, Bowie, Smith's reference points and stuff like that, and it picked out some songs that we were proud of, and I can't remember exactly what it said, but it sort of reflected back at us what we were trying to achieve almost, which is something that you're not quite sure of if you're just ploughing away in your own little space, if you know what I mean. If you're not having the media reflected back at you, and you're trying to create a new sound, you almost need someone outside to judge it and to sort of like to evaluate it sometimes. And that was the first time we'd actually read what someone else thought of our band, which is quite interesting.
The Drowners was your first single proper, and sort of straight away,
yeah,
said the impact of it was enormous. Do you remember recording it and after the session listening back and going, this is right, this is what we intended to do, this will have the desired effect?
Yeah, and I think we were all really, really proud of that record. I still think it's a great record, The Drowners. I listened back to it recently. We've been doing stuff for the best of Suede, and listening back to the old songs, and Drowners is one of those ones that really still stands up. It's a great record.
Welcome back to The First Time here on Six Music with me, Matt Everett, where we look at some of the key first moments and songs from a musician's life. And today's subject is Brett Anderson from Suede, and you just heard Metal Mickey, the band's second single from 1992. When the band's self-titled first album came out a year later, it was a huge hit both critically and commercially, thrusting the band into the mainstream media spotlight. I asked Brett how that felt.
It wasn't intimidating. I think it's what we always wanted. I think we always wanted to kind of reach a bit further than the indie ghetto. I didn't just want to be a kind of a grey band, sort of like chugging away at a guitar looking at my shoes. I think we always wanted to sort of we had sort of aspirations towards making pop music and kind of connecting with real people rather than just music obsessives. So it wasn't scary. It was sort of like what we always wanted. We always thought the point of it was to go a little bit further than that. Yeah.
But there's that thing about be careful what you wish for. If you kind of want adulation and mainstream crossover success, then when you get there, it's never quite the way you expect.
No, absolutely. And it's looking back on it, it's I almost wish that we had sort of kind of contained our ambition a little bit and been a little bit less shooting for the stars in a funny sort of way. We kind of we just went off on a tangent and just right, we're going to be the biggest band ever sort of thing. And you always kind of fall down to earth.
One of the other things that the album is supposed to kind of signify is the kind of opening salvo of US music dominance of the British market was kind of shaken. And Stone Roses and Manchester to an extent, but this felt like music for the UK by the UK the UK, without being nationalistic about it, but it felt very much like that. Was that an intentional
It was very unintentional. Well, obviously I didn't have those kind of, what I was doing was intentional, but it was just meant to be a document of my life. My life lived as a sort of like a kind of, a person living in the city, a poor white boy living in the city. That's what it was, and it became almost like this sort of like blueprint for Britpop and all those sorts of things, But when I was first writing, I was just trying to be honest about my life and how I saw it. I wasn't trying. I didn't want to sort of write in rock cliches. I didn't want to write, using John Lennon's words or Jimi Hendrix's words or Jim Morrison's words. I wanted to sort of like write about Brett Anderson's life, and that's what I did. And because some of that, was kind of it kind of just got twisted and turned into something that I didn't intend at first, I think.
When the follow-up came out, Dogman Star, which is regarded as one of the band's masterpiece in many ways,
yeah,
the second record.
Yeah.
At the time, it wasn't regarded as that at all.
No.
It didn't really connect with people, partially because at the time, you mentioned Britpop, we have to cover it. You were surrounded by your Park Lives and you were surrounded by your Definitely Maybes. Do you remember the album coming out and thinking, this is just not... I can see why people aren't going to get this, because it's all Dayglow, chirpy Cockneys and surly Northerners.
Well,
not like that.
We deliberately made the record not like that, because as soon as we were aware of this sort of like jingoistic, nationalistic kind of cartoon thing that was happening, we wanted to make something that rejected that. It's an album about kind of like loneliness and alienation and ambition and very, very kind of like sort of like un-Britpop notions. But it was a shame what happened with that album, because I think more than just the sort of Britpop thing happening in parallel was also the fact that Bernard had left the band, and that kind of issue clouded people's judgment of it as well.
When did you first realise he was going to leave? Or that he was no longer wanted in the band? Pick your answer.
Yeah, well, no, God, I've been asked this question so many times, and it's sort of difficult. I can't even really remember exactly what happened, to be honest. I think we both wanted different things out of Suede. That's the truth of it. I think it's a tragedy that he did leave the band. I think that Dogman Star and the debut Suede album are really good records and still stand up today. And I do think sometimes I wonder what a third Suede album with Bernard would have been like. And but you never know. No one will ever know. It's one of those what ifs. Maybe it was just supposed to sort of burn brightly and burn for a short time. We were talking about the Sex Pistols earlier, and you don't really want to hear a second Sex Pistols album, do you? You just got one album.
There was a beauty to that, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah. There's a beauty in its transience, and yeah.
It's also a record that's rumoured to be dominated by some reasonably prolific drug use. Was that the case as well?
Yeah, there was lots of, drugs flying around, but that was part of the, the lifestyle at the time. It was pretty crazy. Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of quite sort of surreal kind of visions on the record. Like that time I was kind of like, I was just floating off. I was off on one.
Do you think that was a reaction to the expectations for the record? Because a lot was expected off that record. No matter how strange you're making it and how you're trying to do something that's separate to what's going on. It was the second Suede album. The first record had been such a massive crossover success.
I don't know. I wasn't really... I'm not sure if I was consciously worried about that. I think I was aware that it had to be really special, but I certainly wasn't aware of it having to sort of shift a certain number of units. We really didn't think about that. In fact, quite the opposite. I think we were trying to make us quite an uncompromising record. I mean, the first sort of like version of the song Asphalt World was I think about 18 minutes long. It wasn't until we actually kind of like got in there and edited it. It's quite out there. We were trying to make a record that was, like I say, quite uncompromising.
When did you first decide that you were going to carry on though? Or was that an immediate decision? Had you planned that out as a group or personally?
After Bernard had left, you mean?
Yeah.
I think there wasn't a question of splitting up. Actually, I think I think it was quite almost bloody minded. Do you know what I mean? It was like everyone expected us to split up, and so we decided we weren't going to. We were going to carry on, and it was quite important for us to do that. I think that we felt that there was like a kind of spirit in the band that should be bigger than, you know, tiffs. And we went about looking for a replacement for Bernard, which is a huge thing to do. But we did it quite casually at the time. I think, you know, looking back at it now, you know, I think it was a thing we did with the arrogance of youth, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure if I'd approach it in the same way now, but we just kind of like blithely carried on and said, yeah, we can get a replacement. And we got Richard Oakes, who was very young at the time, and I heard a cassette that he'd actually sent into the office. He just heard that Bernard had left the band, and he just, off his own steam, just sort of sent a cassette in, and it was actually him playing My Insatiable One. And I just heard it and instinctively thought, well, he's pretty amazing, actually. He can really play. Didn't know how young he was. Called up, I managed to call the house, the number that he'd left, and his mum answered, and he was like, you know, he was like an 18-year-old, you know, just at college. So, yeah, that was a whole kettle of fish.
So what were you listening to in terms of the music you were kind of being influenced by? Because Dogman Star's a very different record. Then you've kind of got this period where potential reinvention, what are you going to do for the record to follow up? What were can you remember the things that were affecting you musically at that time?
I wasn't really listening to much contemporary music, actually.
Old stuff?
I didn't listen to much contemporary music at the time. Old stuff, I suppose, sort of like, you know, lots of things like T-Rex at the time, and the Kinks and things like that. I was listening to
pure pop.
Yeah, I was really, really quite obsessed with a T-Rex album called Tanks. For some reason, that just really connected with me. It was kind of a slightly obscure album, but I just really liked the whole T-Rex thing, and that's what informed the next Suede album coming up.
What's the track off Tanks? That
there's a song called Broken Hearted Blues, which I really love, actually.
What is it about,
really
that
beautiful
track?
I don't really know. It's just really it's kind of like a sort of mid-tempo ballad song, but it's beautiful.
That record coming up, 1996, first album with a new lineup. It caught everyone off guard by being critically very well received.
Yeah.
Musically very strong and very popular as well. It kind of, that's the holy trinity of what you want, isn't it, really?
Yeah,
and
it did kind of work, that one.
That must have felt pretty good.
It did, yeah. It's kind of weird. I think lots of people have counted the band out and just assumed that, yeah, they're not going to recover from this sort of body blow of Bernard leaving, and we were kind of determined to prove everyone wrong. And it was almost like it was a very, very important record, that, for us coming up, to make that record successful and to make it a really good record. You know, I put so much of my blood, sweat and tears into that record. You know, it was almost like I felt as though, get that right and everything falls into place, get it wrong and it's all over. Do you know what I mean? It was a real pivotal moment in our career, I thought. And we wanted to make a pop record, you know, after Dogman Star, which was quite a dank,
good word,
emotionally tortured record.
It's a dank record.
It's a dank record.
It's a glorious record.
Gloriously dank.
Yeah, it's kind of like, so yeah, gilded but dank.
I think it's almost the green, the cover, the greenness of it, almost like there's a sort of like underwater quality it's got. You know, it's like the bottom of a swimming pool that hasn't been cleaned for a few years. You know, or yeah. Anyway, I won't elaborate. And coming up was very much, you know, the polar opposite of that. It was supposed to be a bright, communicative kind of pop record. You know, no flab on it. You know, lots of. We wanted it almost to be an album of singles, sort of 10 singles.
And that was a good time for the band.
It was a great time for the band. It was like being a sort of new band again. Coming up was like another debut, actually. So it had all that kind of like energy of a debut album again. It's very exciting, yeah.
I was in doubt.
Yeah, I think possibly we should have split up after Head Music. I think that probably would have been, in terms of our, you know, without wanting to sound pompous, in terms of our legacy or whatever, that would have been better. You know, we shouldn't have made the fifth album, A New Morning. It was an album that was made in kind of like, we were quite confused about what we wanted the band to be. I didn't quite know where I wanted to go with it. I was trying to reinvent it.
As what?
Don't know. I mean, there's part of me that sort of almost wanted to make almost like a folk record. Quite acoustic and quite beautiful and harmonies and stuff like that.
What sort of thing were your touch points for that?
I was listening to Grandaddy a lot, actually. And I liked the way that they kind of combined sort of mellow folk with kind of electronica. I thought it was really incredibly beautiful and surprising combination that they managed to do really well. But I don't think I was focused enough at the time to make it work, and we actually had a couple of cracks at that record. We made a version of it with a guy called Tony Hoffa, this American producer who'd worked with Beck, and ended up scrapping it because it just sounded terrible, and we ended up redoing it with Stephen Street, and that's the version that you hear.
First kind of going public and saying the band was over, that must have been really emotional, because
yeah, it was hard
thing to do.
Yeah, it was really hard. It's like it's like kind of breaking up a family or something like that. I thought about it for a year before I actually did it.
As long as that?
Yeah, I thought about it for a long, long time. I kind of thought about it and deliberated. And
were you putting it off because you were scared of what would happen?
I was putting it off because I couldn't decide whether it was the right thing to do or not. It's a huge decision to make, and I certainly didn't make it lightly. And I think it was, looking back on it, the right thing to do, because I did feel sort of at the end of the line creatively. I didn't know where to take it. And I think when you feel like that, you've got to be honest with yourself and kind of initiate a change that addresses that. And for me, breaking the band up and doing and having done what I've done subsequently has really woken me up as an artist. I don't know if we'd have made a 6th Suede album or 7th Suede album, it might have just kind of gradually drifted into obsolescence.
And then there was this whole hoo-ha about, he's going to speak to Bernard again. He's going to speak. They've been spotted. 2 people that looked a bit like them were spotted buying a Questel somewhere in Camden. My God, 2 people that might have been them were spotted somewhere in Nottingham in a music shop. Or this whole...
Yeah.
Which must have been quite funny, because I think only you 2 could have probably looked at it from the inside and gone, this is a bit ridiculous. We're just,
yeah,
some music, or maybe we won't.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I did call Bernard after the band had split. Yeah, I hadn't spoken to him for 9 years, and we'd made some pretty good stuff together, and I gave him a call, and we went out, had a beer, and had a curry, and talked about making another record again, and we formed the Tears. And,
are you proud of the music you did with him then?
I really am, actually. I think that's a great record. It kind of, yeah. I think it could have been, maybe it was a bit long. Maybe if it was a 13-song album, maybe if it was a 10-song album, it'd been a lot more focused. But I think it's a great record. I think there's a couple of good songs on there. Apollo 13, Autograph, Love as Strong as Death. They're great tracks. Yeah, I really enjoyed working with him again. It was fantastic, and it sort of it did wake me up as an artist. I think I'd sort of become a little bit, you can get sort of set in your ways, and you can have too much power, and then working with someone where the power is even again, where it's a kind of equal relationship. I think it's probably pretty good for you.
Do you find yourself more comfortable kind of helming a ship of a band, or kind of working very much on your own, floating on your own, having to find your own solutions to the songs that you're writing?
I mean, both situations are great in different ways. I did really miss, 7 years, 5 years or whatever, being away from Suede. I sort of did miss the kind of momentum that you can get with a band. But I do love being able to make those decisions for yourself. I loved making the solo records I made. I love the fact that my second solo album was an album just of me and cello player, and those are the kind of things that you simply can't do if you're in a band. That kind of freedom and that kind of you just can't do that. So yeah, both situations are fantastic in different ways.
We've had all these firsts, and we always finish the show with the last record, which is a record that you can choose, which is either something of yours or something that you've loved from your past, or anything that you want. The last record is chosen by you.
Well, I guess I'll choose what I have to say is probably my favourite song that I've ever written, been involved with, whatever. It's The Wild Ones from Dogman Star.